It literally started raining. Like, the sun is out, but there's just a rain cloud like directly overhead.
Hey, Bill, I'm in the mood for a switch up. I hit the function, hit the rose till I hiccup.
The Canon RP was released back in 2019. Now, at the time, this cost around $1,300. Nowadays, you can find it used for about $600. That's how much I paid for this one right here from Canon's own website. So just what do you get with this 4-year-old camera? Well, there's a 26.2 megapixel full frame sensor, 4K video at 24 frames per second, a Digicate processor, and Canon's genuinely good dual pixel autofocus. Literally still raining even though the sun is out. In terms of build quality, the RP is actually pretty solid. It's not a professional level camera, you know, you're not going to find any weather sealing, so you probably shouldn't be filming with it in the rain like I was 2 seconds ago. But having said that, it's a pretty solid camera. You know, it does still have super sturdy build quality. It doesn't feel plasticky or anything like that. The other thing I like about this camera is it's a small camera. You know, it's kind of puts me in the mindset of the Olympus EM1 Mark II in that it's a big style camera, but it's scaled down to a much smaller form factor, and I like that. It actually is super comfortable. All right, I've switched over to the Canon RP now, so from this point onwards, everything that you'll be seeing is filmed on the Canon RP itself. Currently using the Canon EF 28mm f1.8 USM, that old film lens that I had a video on a few weeks ago. Also throughout this video, I'll be using the Canon RF 50mm 1.8 and the RF 16mm f2.8. All right, the rain isn't exactly letting up, so let's come inside for a second and talk about what drove people crazy about this camera when it was first released. The first issue for a lot of people was 4K on this camera. 4K on this camera has a huge crop. And of course, this camera doesn't have IBIS, and so if you use image stabilization, it crops in that much more. And on top of that, and this was probably the most egregious one of all, 4K video doesn't have dual pixel autofocus. It literally resorts to contrast detect autofocus, intentionally. And that was something that, admittedly, and rightfully so, drove people kind of crazy. To put it into perspective, here's this exact same scene in 4K. I haven't moved at all. That's how much of a crop there is. And notice how it's focusing on those water bottles in the background and not the person right here? That's because there's no dual pixel autofocus. It has no idea that there's actually a person. And this is only the most basic image stabilization. Let's take it up a notch to full image stabilization. Okay, that's with image stabilization on all the way. This is a 28mm lens. That's like arm's distance away from me. This is the shot that you're getting in 4K. And for anyone who's curious, let me turn image stabilization off all the way so you can see the full size of it. Okay, so that's 4K with image stabilization off. Cameras at arm's distance, all on a 28mm lens. It's literally just part of my head to right here. That combined with the terrible autofocus is kind of frustrating. And that's why I always use this camera in 1080p. See, right now we're in 1080p, 24 frames per second, and we have image stabilization on the first setting. There's a little bit of a crop, but not too bad. 28mm looks pretty much like a true 28mm focal length. And that leads us to another thing that really frustrated people with this camera when it first came out, and that's the fact that it didn't have 24 frames per second in 1080p, which wasn't a software limitation, it wasn't a hardware limitation, it was literally Canon just openly and honestly trying to force you to spend more money on a more expensive camera. They reserved 24 frames per second for their high-end cameras. They didn't want an entry-level camera to have 24 frames per second, and people lost their minds over that. People were outraged to sort of Bud Light proportions that actually made Canon stop and say, hey, you know what? Our bad, we'll give you 24 frames per second. So If that's one of those things that you're worried about because you keep seeing old reviews of this camera, the RP does in fact now have 24 frames per second. Another simple thing that kind of made people mad is the lack of any real slow motion. You know, you've got 1080p all the way up to 60 frames per second, which is pretty good. All of the slow motion B-roll that I've been filming on this camera, I film 1080p, 60 frames per second. Another thing that I saw a lot of people complain about with this camera is the fact that it doesn't have IBIS. That's true, there is no IBIS, but it does have electronic image stabilization, and it's surprisingly good. Now, I've actually already filmed an entire video dedicated just to stabilization on this camera. If you want to check it out, it's in the same playlist as this video. But the point being, you've got two different settings. One is standard and the other is enhanced. Currently, we're filming in enhanced. Yes, there is a bit of a crop, but the thing is, it works surprisingly well. I mean, it's not quite on par with what you would get from an action camera. No full-frame camera is on that level yet. But having said that, the stabilization on the RP is weirdly good. Now, where the RP struggles is where a lot of Canon cameras, ever since they first started making digital cameras back in 2001, have struggled, and that's dynamic range. See, what you guys can't see is that's a blue sky back there. On camera, that just looks perfectly white and blown out, like you can't really see any color or any detail. But that's the unfortunate nature of trying to expose for the subject when you don't have a lighting source for the subject. If you're just using natural light to light your subject, you're going to get a lot of white backgrounds. In terms of photography, the RP is great. You've got a 26.2 megapixel full-frame sensor. You've got Canon color science. It's more of like Canon's modern color science, and maybe this is just because I'm getting older, but I always think of like 2008, like Canon 5D Mark II color science, and this is kind of like that, but a much more subdued take on it. You know, in the old days, Canon color science was just so punchy and so contrasty and so saturated. This still has the contrast and saturation, but it's much more subtle than it used to be. It's a lot more toned down than what you were getting, say, back in 2008 with any of those cameras. You know, having spent a few months now walking around just taking random pictures here and there with the RP, I've been genuinely enjoying it. I say this a lot on this channel, but if all you focus on is the spec sheet, you will never actually experience the camera itself. You know, at the time that the RP came out, there were so many people who just literally glanced at the specs of this camera and immediately wrote it off. Not only did they write it off, it was the worst camera they'd ever seen. You know, this is typical Canon. Why would Canon do such a thing? I mean, the RP is one of those cameras that people made my least favorite type of review. The video where the person explains why they hate the camera, but they've never even seen it in person. They've never actually used the camera, but they know it's the worst camera that's ever existed. You know, it's those kind of reviews that are like, why the RP isn't pro enough for me, or why pros would never use the Canon RP. It just, at that point, they had literally never even seen the camera in person before, but they have a strong opinion because they've read the spec sheet. That's all well and good, but like I say, if that's how you treat cameras, then you will never actually experience the camera itself. Canon RP is a great example of that. so many people wrote this camera off when it was released, and I was always just kind of curious, you know. I was like, it seems fine. I don't know, it's not great, it's not top of the line specs, but I'm sure it works. I'm sure you can film a good video with the RP. I'm sure you can take good pictures with the RP. And that's just it, you know. When I saw the price of this camera on Canon's website come down to $599, I just jumped on that right away. I was just curious, man. I just wanted to see, like, hey, what's this camera actually like in real life? And much to my surprise, it's become one of my favorite cameras. And, you know, you guys that watch this channel know I'm a camera collector. I've got a bunch of different cameras. Don't care about camera brands. I like all brands, all that stuff. It takes a lot for me to say this is one of my favorites. You know, I'm putting this up there with like the Olympus EM1 Mark II or like the Nikon D200 for photography. The RP has really caught me by surprise. You know, I just kind of thought I was buying this because it was cheap. I had no idea that I was going to fall in love with this camera the way that I have. For me, what I've found is the RP covers all of the basic bases, and it does it really well. You know, I need good looking 1080p footage. Okay, well, the RP does that. I need at least 60 frames per second so I can film slow motion B-roll. RP does that. I need some kind of stabilization for when I'm filming handheld. RP has really good electronic stabilization. I need a mic input and an articulating screen for filming these YouTube videos. RP has that. I need really good, reliable autofocus. The RP also does that. When you actually use this camera in real life, instead of just bitching and moaning about the spec sheet, you start to realize, hey man, this is a solid camera. And then when you take into consideration that it comes available from time to time for as low as $599, that's crazy. You're getting literally a full-frame mirrorless camera for $600. That price is utterly outrageous. Like, you just don't see that kind of value that often. So in kind of a funny way, it's like all the spec sheet haters, the people who just glance at those specs and say, okay, well, that camera sucks, I would never consider it. Good. Let's keep those people away from this. This will be our camera. You know, you guys and me will know how good the RP is, and when we see it for like $599 on the Canon website, we can jump on that bargain. Let's keep the haters away. Let's have those people not knowing about that. We don't need them knowing about our camera. Anyway, I think that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.